this first video is going to start off with water and air quality issues that people have experienced and that have been pretty well documented in not just in California, but all over the United States. Before I get into what the biggest problems are in water quality and problems in air quality, I want to talk about one specific case. You can start to see how the contamination issues resulted in drinking water problems and then resulted in health problems for people who are incarcerated in these facilities. So if you'll zoom in with me, we're going to start 30 miles north of Bakersfield in a town called Delano with this prison, Kern Valley State Prison. And so this prison, from the time that it was built in 2007 until a drinking water plant was built and added on to manage the quality of drinking water, had arsenic in its drinking water twice the legal limit that it was providing to its prisoners. So I worked on this case in 2021 and 2022, actually, when I was taking a drinking water course in the environmental studies department at UC Santa Cruz as a graduate student. And so my friend and I, Summer, we started looking into the problems that people had told us that there were problems at this facility, but no one had really done a historical study to explain how did this drinking water problem happen and who was affected by it. So we started with what were the violations that the prison was given for having too much arsenic in its water. And so you can see on this slide that from 2008, it starts in 2007, but they weren't uploaded to this database. But starting in 2007, when the facility was built, up until 2013, they were regularly cited. They were given violations for having over the maximum contaminant limit for arsenic concentration in the drinking water. And so these are, if you can see, there's one that's for lead and copper, but the majority of them are for arsenic. And so this was happening, and this was being documented by the local water board, and their violations were being given to the prison. And at the same time, incarcerated people were filing lawsuits against the prison and state for the health impacts that they were experiencing. So I'll give you a second to read the quote on the screen. So this quote was from this man, Lamar Singleton, who, when arriving to the facility in the first few months, lost 50 pounds and noticed that and felt himself become very, very ill. So he eventually was diagnosed with kidney cancer, but had to petition the doctors to biopsy both of his kidneys, which took a really long time. And then by the time that they diagnosed him, there was no time for treatment, and they just immediately removed one of his kidneys, which makes him immunocompromised, gives him all of these other problems that he's going to have to deal with for the rest of his life. I'll give you a second to read the quote on the screen. This was another person that we interviewed named Antoine Slaughter, and he gives us an idea that it wasn't just a few people who were having medical problems who felt like there was a problem with the water. He says that everyone knew, and everyone avoided drinking the water if at all possible. Silas Falson, who this quote is from on the screen, he was sent to the emergency room for impaired heart function, something that he still, again, has to live with today. And he, in this quote, talks not just about the immediate effects of drinking arsenic-contaminated water, but how he had that experience over several years, which he thinks has led to his heart condition. And if you're reading this quote, you're seeing that John W. Williams is talking not just about the physical impacts, the immediate physical impacts of drinking contaminated water, but the mental health impacts of knowing that what you're drinking is hurting your health, but having no other option but to drink contaminated water. And as I'm sure you all know, Bakersfield is in the Central Valley. So Delano is in an area that today, right now, the high temperature for today is 110 degrees. And so you know that you're going to be sweating a lot, even if you're in the best air conditioned facilities, which is really unlikely if you're in a California prison. You're going to be sweating a lot and you're going to be needing to drink water. And so if you're seeing yourself get ill from this water, it's a really stressful situation, as John Williams says. So that was one case, and prisoners in Kern Valley State Prison are no longer drinking contaminated water, but the problem that we're having to deal with now is, what do we do with people who have developed lifelong illnesses from their treatment in prison and from the environmental justice issues that they encountered in prison? So, of the 3 types of water injustice that we're going to be talking today that are pretty common in prisons throughout the United States, the first is heavy metals, and arsenic is one of these. There are a few other ones, like copper and lead, as you can see in this slide. And there's been a lot of reports. Honestly, in the past 5 years, there have been more reports than ever of people linking experiences that they're having in like Nebraska to experiences they're having in New Jersey or Florida or Texas or California. So, and amidst all of these linking, we're seeing that there's a pattern of arsenic contamination, which was a really notable case of the Supreme Court ruling against a prison in Texas. And then we saw these scientists did a study that compared all of the prison systems' water in the Southwest to the nearby water facilities to say, well, if you're in a town and there's a prison there, are both places equally as likely to have arsenic contamination? And the researchers found the answer is no. The prisons are 5.7 times more likely to have water that's in violation of the arsenic limit. So that means that it's not just an accident, or it's not just based on like where they're located and there's already arsenic there. They're getting put in areas and they're getting systemically directed to water sources that are contaminated. We saw the same thing. We've starting to see the same thing with copper. There's one case of a Nebraska women's prison where there was high copper levels for more than 10 years. And then in cases like Flint, Michigan, which is something that you all learned about in Module 1, we see that people who are incarcerated in areas where there's wide-scale contamination are being hit even harder, because their access to clean drinking water is that much harder if you don't have the ability to go out to the store and buy something, and if the commissary prices are as high as they often are in prison, and the supplies are limited, which is also often the case. And so we've seen people come out of Illinois state prisons who have needed to undergo lead exposure treatment, which is incredibly painful and expensive. And so we know that there are all of these problems. And right now, the research is trying to link them up and explain what's going on, why is this what are the sources for all of this stuff, and what is the solution? The second type so if the first type of water injustice is heavy metals, the second type is forever chemicals. And so you might have heard about this, I'm sure you have, of PFAS contamination, which is this per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, which are known to have a whole myriad of human health effects and are really difficult to treat. So they're considered some of the most toxic substances that you can be exposed to and that you really don't want to have in your drinking water. Well, it turns out in a study that was published a few months ago that 47% of prisons in the United States are downstream of PFAS contamination and are likely giving the incarcerated people there PFAS contaminated water. So that's the second big problem. And then the third big problem is bacterial contamination. So when you have a bunch of people all on the same water system, this happens in schools and in hospitals pretty regularly, but prisons seem to have their have a particular problem with eliminating bacterial contamination. In San Quentin in 2015, there was a huge outbreak of Legionnaire's disease where 13 incarcerated people and 3 staff members tested positive, and more than 90 people were quarantined for having symptoms of Legionnaire's disease, which is a waterborne illness. So it was getting into their water system. After this, we saw that there are other cases. More recently in 2022 in Illinois, we've seen them in Pennsylvania and New Jersey, and we've even seen more cases in California since 2020. So as we're talking about water contamination, we see that the design of the prisons is a really big part of, if there isn't a treatment facility built in, or if they don't have systems of eliminating bacterial contamination, those are really big problems. And hold on to those, because we're going to address that in a second, right after we talk about air quality issues. So the 3 types of air quality issues that we're going to be talking about that have been recognized in prisons and that are relatively well studied compared to the other myriad of issues that we just don't have that much data about are cigarette smoke, their toxic exposure from nearby polluting facilities, and air quality filtration systems, which we know, which has come to light in the past few years particularly. So the first issue that we're going to talk about has been studied pretty well since the 1970s and 80s. Like in a lot of parts of the United States, indoor smoking was legal, and there was nothing particularly wrong with it in the early days of the prison boom. And so this image, while I don't know if it's about cigarette smoking, it indicates to me, like, you can see the things that are going on in this person's lungs, and you can also see all of the things that are contributing into this, like, secondhand smoke cloud at the top of the scene. And so there are a lot of studies that have come out where they measure all these different, they have all these ways of measuring the pollutants that are inside of facilities that come specifically from secondhand smoke. It's kind of difficult to eradicate cigarettes because there still are a lot of cigarettes in prisons, even though if they're not allowed to be. But that's a place where you know that a lot of people who already have asthma or who already have other types of respiratory conditions are being exposed to particulate matter that they have no way to avoid. They cannot install an air purifier in their cell. First of all, there's no like way of separating the air that they breathe from the air from the rest of the facility, and they have no means by which to clean it on their own. So they're really at the behest of the prison administrators to implement any policies to change their air quality. So that's the first one. And so you can imagine how that would either create or exacerbate breathing issues that people have in prison. The second is polluting facilities that are nearby where prisons are located. So there's all kinds of different, you can imagine, like coal-fired power plants. You could imagine that some manufacturing industries, you could imagine that highways, or, you know, any of these types of sources of particulate matter and of air quality problems are likely the case where prisons are located. And especially if we think back to that surplus land question from the first lecture, about where are prisons more likely to be located after 1970, and that is in areas where it's potentially there's a pollution-related issue that makes them not viable for development for housing. So this is a case that we saw in Pennsylvania where there was toxic coal ash that was flying into the facility. It was being dumped nearby and going into the facility, and people were developing all kinds of cancer and respiratory issues. Even I think a lot of the people who were working in the facility were as well. So, and as you can see by the title of this, there was no escape for people. You cannot, there's something just blowing into the area that you're confined into. There's not much that can be done. So the third issue that we're going to talk about today is ventilation and air conditioning systems. So you may have heard about HVAC systems. I think it's become a lot more widely known what our air filtration systems do in the face of COVID, and knowing that they can really reduce the spread of airborne illnesses. And I think there were a handful of scholars that were talking before 2020 about the problems in prisons with HVAC systems, particularly because in a lot of cells there was not airflow, there was not regular airflow, which meant that people who had respiratory illnesses were potentially more likely to be in a high concentration CO2, so meaning they're exhaling a lot, and that makes it difficult if you have pre-existing issues. Additionally, airborne diseases are not getting filtered out regularly. And if we have these other issues like pollution, for external pollution or indoor cigarette smoke, those are just all kind of contributing into this. If you could imagine like a large smoke cloud of possible air contaminants that are inside a prison that are not being filtered out because the HVAC systems are oftentimes they were not designed to work very well in the first place. They're not being updated or repaired as necessary. And so there was this kind of ongoing problem that was not being addressed until in 2020, we saw that COVID, and it was devastating, but prison facilities, some prison and jail facilities had the highest incidence of COVID in the country and sometimes in the world in like April 2020 or the later months, where it could be much more easily tracked that poor ventilation quality, like ventilation systems not working, was directly related to the incidence and spread of COVID inside prison facilities. So this map, you can see the COVID spikes. This is produced by the COVID Behind Bars project at UCLA. And there were spikes all over the country, but you can also see that in California, there were a particular instance, a kind of concentration of high rates of COVID. When we look back over the past 4 years, I think it's been calculated that people in prison have been 3 to 4 times more likely on average to get COVID as people in the general population. And so you can only imagine how regularly this disease is in prison and is circulating in prison, in part because of the poor ventilation systems and bad design for airflow. So when you're thinking about, and I'm sure as a viewer of this video, you're thinking about, well, there's a lot of design elements that seem to be producing and perpetuating these problems of water quality and air quality. And I would say you're absolutely right. When you saw that graph of prisons that were built before 1970 versus after 1970, you saw that there were like what seemed like twice as many prisons that were built after 1970 all over the country. These things were going up like every year in a lot of states. And so if you had to guess, like, are these being designed with the highest standards of residential air quality and water quality regulations in them? Most likely not. Like, these were being put up super quickly with less with the intention to spend less money because there was a lot of government cost cutting that was going on at the same time. And so what we saw are these prison facilities that maybe didn't have good water or air quality systems to begin with, and certainly do not have them now. There's been a move in the past few years, and this was published in August 2022, to rethink ethical design in prisons, which for me is not something I'm super interested in. I don't know. There's a tagline in Los Angeles County that people say you can't get well in a cell. I don't think that well-being works super well with depriving people of their personal freedoms. I think those are often contradictory in nature, but there is a movement now to try to like redesign or correct for these massive design oversights, which now are coming to bear on all of these people having health problems arising from particularly water and air quality issues.